Hello and welcome everybody. I am the Marginal Non-hermit and I have a book review for you today. Today I'm going to be talking about the book How to Think About the Economy, a Primer by Per Bylund. It's a little short book that came out just recently and we'll be talking about this. So this is the book in question. Nice little paperback. Not very thick. But kind of that, attractive bright orange color cover and just, some basic cover art. So this book is nice. It's short and it's light. It's only about 132 pages. It's inexpensive or possibly free at Mises events. I picked up my copy for free. They just had a big pile of them on a table, and they were like, "Hey, free books by Per Bylund." I'm like, "Yeah, cha-ching! All right." Anyway, so what can I say about this book? It's short. It's an introduction to economics from a somewhat Austrian perspective, but mostly just kind of like a value-free economic perspective. Most classical economists wouldn't have a problem with stuff in this. I guess neoclassical ? It gives you a solid introduction to economic concepts, especially from the Austrian perspective. It's generally clear. It's generally succinct. It has a strong focus on entrepreneurship as an issue. This is something that you won't find in a lot of economics books, especially introductory books. The Austrian approach keeps everything kind of at a good macroeconomic... Sorry, that's exactly wrong. It keeps everything at a good kind of microeconomic level, and the acts of individuals as entrepreneurs are very important from this perspective. So, Professor Bylund does a good job of keeping this perspective going and making everything work well. There are a bunch of really excellent points that are made in this book. You would expect a book like this often to be kind of boilerplate, but there's actually quite a bit here that is both interesting and poignant and well written. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So at the start of chapter 2. On pages 21 through 22, Bylund makes this statement. Quote, "It is not enough to produce a consistent whole based on first principles if those principles are themselves flawed. After all, it is possible to produce an internally consistent theory based on faulty assumptions. Such systems can appear very convincing because they are consistent, but they still fail to provide real understanding because every explanation hinges on something that is not true and is perhaps not even unreasonable." Now, readers of Rand will recognize this as kind of a check your premises statement. And this is something that is very important in an economics textbook because it's very possible to get into the weeds of models and these complicated ideas without really looking at what's going on behind the scenes. And you can easily, if you're not careful, pick up a lot of incorrect assumptions and base a system on that, and that's what Bylund is cautioning us about here, very early in the book, chapter 2. At the start of chapter 3, page 27. Quote, "The free market in economics is a model, an analytical tool. It excludes complicating circumstances and influences and allows us to study core economic phenomena on their own," emphasis his, "so that they are not mistaken for other effects. In economics, we are interested in understanding the nature and relationships of economic forces. In other words, we exclude things that hamper the economy, such as regulations, that impose upon people's behavior and therefore economic outcomes. The result is an economy where only economic forces, not political forces, that's my addition, are at play, a, quote, free market." So, ending that quotation. This is also important because it is a different perspective on why we're looking at it from a free market perspective. There are a lot of writers who will say we're looking at this from a free market perspective because that's the only correct perspective, or they'll try to shuffle values in there somehow. But this, and especially to me as a physicist, as a scientist, is important because what he's saying here is that we're not ignoring, We're not ignoring external non-free market influences because we don't like them. We're ignoring them because they complicate things in such a way that may lead us in the wrong direction as far as our reasoning goes. This is something that's very common in science. You make a model that strips away a lot of the complications. He goes on to compare the free market economy to a free fall system where you ignore, for instance, wind resistance. You ignore the variation in gravitational acceleration as a function of height. You ignore wind currents. You ignore stuff like that. By treating the free market assumptions as a basic set of assumptions, you get two things out of that. One, you establish the free market as a groundwork upon which things need to be built up, if at all. That already gives you a convincing reason to stick with the free market as much as possible, as opposed to saying, well, we're going to get into kind of a public goods model going on or something like that very soon. The other thing that it does is that it underscores how important it is to start from a model that is as pure and simple as possible, and then to build things on top of it after that. One other thing that I want to talk about is, and I won't quote it this time, but on pages 85 and 86, Bylund is especially careful to talk about how ridiculously effective specialization is. And this is something you won't find in a lot of introductory economics texts. Specialization, in this case, I guess I will kind of, maybe not quote, but I'll just kind of paraphrase here. That based on some writings of Adam Smith, for instance, he tried to pin down what the effective multiplication factor of high specialization could be. And the point that Smith was at pains to make is that the difference between a dude working by himself making nails with an anvil and a hammer and some steel wire versus a factory where a person is only doing one small action, but they're very specialized at that action, they have capital behind them, is that the factor is ridiculous. It's like 42,000 times. And that's another thing that you won't really get good numbers at in a lot of economics textbooks. They'll say specialization is important, but they'll kind of leave it hanging, that it's like it's a 10% effect, or it's a 20% effect. No, the answer is actually quite stunning. I was actually even taken aback by it a bit when I read it. I will note that there are a couple minor dings that I want to just kind of elucidate. On page 68, and I'll quote it because I want to be careful here. Quote, "We cannot compare the subjective values of different people, as their experience satisfactions are personal." End quote. This is not quite true. In fact, what needs to be added in there somewhere is the word numerically. Any exchange is a comparison of values. If Adam has A and trades it for B, and Bob has B and trades it for A, that gives us information about their relative comparisons of their subjective values of this item, of these items A and B. This is something that kind of reminded me when I read it of something that I learned from Bob Murphy, the economist. This was in one of his podcast episodes. I didn't take the time to track it down because it was kind of a fleeting remark. But at one time in the past, he was writing an essay in school. This was when he was still a student. And he made some kind of rhetorical flourish, some kind of hyperbolic statement. And a fairly mild one that you would almost see. And the teacher said, well, you've made this sentence from something that was true and correct into something that was not true and incorrect. And the problem with doing that, of course, is that you leave an opening for any critics to say, "Oh, hey, you're lying here, or you're just wrong here." And so what Bob said in this podcast episode is that, and I'm paraphrasing again, is that you should not sacrifice accuracy for brevity or rhetorical punch. You should always try to make sure that your statements are as punchy as they can be, but they also have to be correct, in isolation. It's important because if you're making these kinds of statements, it's very easy for critics to strawman your position by picking out a couple of places where you exaggerated too much and say, well, this is clearly not a true text because there's a lot going on here where he's using hyperbole to say that this never happens when in fact it rarely does happen. Another point that I have against the way that this book is organized is the section on intervention. So, as I said earlier, we're talking, Bylund talks about looking at the economy from a free market perspective as a simplifying effect. And then in the third part of the book, the last 20 pages or so, he goes into a chunk of about intervention. And in my opinion, it both comes on way too quick and it's way too early to make this point. He has to shoehorn in a bunch of things he hasn't really talked about very well. Time preference, interest rates, central banking. These things all make very minor appearances in the intervention part. And the point is made, but it's not made as you would generally try to make a point in a primer or primer, whatever. So, just to kind of sum up here, I will note that this book is basic, not comprehensive. It is a good introduction. It's light on citations, which is reasonable. There's not a whole lot here where you have to, where he's like making some kind of reference to some other book. There are a few citations here or there where he's actually doing that. But I will say that even if you are a fairly avid amateur scholar of economics, this book is probably worth picking up. And here's why. There is a section at the end, at the very, very end, called Further Reading. Yeah. Can I ever get that in focus? Yeah, Further Reading. And this section is a little chunk of gold. It makes up for the book being fairly light and fairly thin, because what's in there is a really solid collection of more detailed and in-depth works by a variety of authors. Now, Bylund could have quoted a book by Mises and a book by Rothbard, and a book by Mises and a book by Rothbard, and hey, here's Hayek to say hello, and that could have been that. Based on the topics that he's looking at, that could have been the whole further reading section. It's just the works of those two authors plus a couple of Hayeks popped in, right? Because those two authors themselves did do a lot of work in all of the topics that he did. And by the way, the further reading section is arranged by topic, which is nice, really nice. However, what Bylund did is he tried very hard to ensure that there were several sources on every topic and that none of those sources were, or very few of those sources were the same authors. So I'm just gonna read some names here, but we've got something by Donald Lavoie, we've got Karl Menger, we've got Ludwig Mises, we've got Rothbard, we've got Joe Salerno, we've got Roger Garrison, we've got David Gordon, we've got Hans-Hermann Hoppe, we've got George Selgin. The free banking argument is a thing. We've got Israel Kirzner. We've got Ludwig Lochmann. There are a bunch of names in here and a bunch of books in here that Bylund is recommending that you read based on topic that are pure dynamite. And unless you actually have gone to formal schooling as an economist, which very few of us have, you might not have read a lot of these books. I myself consider myself moderately well read. Not like I'm a physicist. This is not my main game, but I consider myself reasonably well read as far as free market economics goes. And I had only read about a quarter of the books in this thing. And that's not a humble brag. That they were the ones that I had read are the ones that everybody who's like me has read. So. This gave me a bunch of names and a bunch of books and a bunch of topics that I can dig deeper into when I feel like it. And I'm hoping it'll do the same for you. So, with that, I'll close down this review and I'll just say, Per Bylund's book, How to Think About the Economy, a primer. Definitely pick it up. If you visit Mises' events, you might be able to pick it up for free. It's free online. I'll put a link in the description. But I mean, like, if you want to support the Mises Institute, I think it's $5. I'll put that link in the description too. So anyway, great book, great little intro book, but still good even if you're already in this space. So yeah, give it a look.